It's funny. Abeni's song is also I say this again. I probably say a lot. One of those things that it is older. It is probably one of the oldest stories that I have. Older than a Master of Jin stories. Older even than Ring Shout. I had been thinking of this story for a very very long time. And part of that was my first when I first started trying to write speculative fiction. A lot of my speculative fiction, first of all, it was didactic. I grew up, thanks to my mom, I was watching a lot of black and white Twilight Zones. So I know all those Twilight Zones. And so a lot of my first short stories were, aha, at the end, you didn't think that was coming. And it had these moral political tales. And one of the other things that I was doing was I was heavily trying to create, because I love fantasy, fantasy that was more diverse, right? I grew up on a lot of Tolkien, for instance, and I love Tolkien. But I was like, hey, where are all the brown people and the black people? Oh, they're on the other side of things. They're riding the elephants. They're pretty antisocial, and oh, that's not so good. I loved R.A. Salvatore, Drizzt Do'Urden, but as you can imagine, there were always problems with Drizzt Do'Urden for any black person who was reading the sagas of Dark Elves. You both loved it, but you're like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable. I don't know how I explain this to friends. And so, I was always looking to how can I create a fantasy that's diverse, that's culturally diverse. The great Charles Saunders, I would find out later, had shown us the way. He's like one of these Afro-Canadian, Afro-American, and then he becomes Afro-Canadian founder of what people consider, African type modern fantasy. He's writing these books in the 1970s. And so I wanted to do something of the sort. I wanted to do something similar. And I first started writing actually the building the world that a Benny song is from an adult perspective. And then I decided at some point I want to pull back and I wanted to write it from the perspective of a younger person because I remembered when I was that age, what middle grade readers were, that is when I was the most avid as far as reading goes, right? This is when you had to my parents had to come in, turn off that light. I would have the flashlight trying to finish my Token or my Danny Dunn book that I'm really dating. It's my Madeline L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time book. I was really into it. So I wanted to capture that moment again. And so that's how a Benny song came into being. But it was one of the first things I actually gave to my agent, but it was kind of like, let's hold off on this, get this other stuff done, and we'll circle back. It's funny, a Benny song, the way I'm using the West African oral traditions, especially my namesake, the Djeli, the idea of the storyteller, the person who would know the entire epic and they can recite it or recite your entire family. And so, in this sense, her song that she sings is actually the history of the village that she's from that's been taken away from her. And then it's also her adventure. And so people, as they start to realize, oh, I'm reading a Benny song, right? She's the last survivor of her village, and she's like, and her story, she adds to the song as she goes along. So it's both a song that she sings. I never really write down, but you understand it's the history of her people, and then her as the remnant of her people. Everything that she's experiencing that we're all reading, this is her song, and this is what you're reading basically. Yeah. The children of night are the main issue in a Benny song. These children, she's searching for these children her village has been destroyed, but the children have been stolen away. So Benny is a regular human girl from a small village. She knows nothing about the outside world at all. Her village is really tiny. She's never seen a city or a kingdom. They're just a small little village. But a small little village, as I pointed out, gets destroyed. Her people are stolen away. She's like the only survivor for the most part, and she's saved basically by this witch, this older woman who's kind of been looking over their village, and then the witch takes her like, "You have become my apprentice now," right? So this is kind of like the premise of the story, but within the story, she's going to end up meeting two other figures who become her good friends. This is Naomi and Zania, and both of them are spirits. And so they look like little girls. They act like, well, actually, it's little girls, at least girls of Benny's age. This would be like 12 or 13. They look and act this way, but you find out each of them was like, oh, I'm 80, I'm 90, right? And Naomi is a porcupine spirit. So though she can appear human when she really tries, her normal look is very large black eyes. She looks mostly human, but she has porcupine quills running down her back and everything else. And Zania is a panther spirit who can either look like a very beautiful 12, 13-year-old girl or a very fierce looking, like almost weird between with sharp teeth. Think like, Thundercats kind of in between, or she can transform to a full medium sized panther, right? And what's interesting here is Naomi is the chatterbox friend you want who loves to dance, is kind of overly innocent, but likes stealing honey and gets you into trouble that way. And Zania is, and I'm going back to Fear from middle school, right? Zania is the haughty, arrogant. If we were like in an 80s film, she would be, oh, that's the rich girl who, who you just don't get along with, right? And part of this is not only does a Benny have to deal with the fact that, well, both of these entities that look like girls and act like girls my age are not, and they're much stronger and different type. They're different beings. They don't understand at times what it's like for me as a mortal human being. But one of them is very, very difficult to get along with, and that's Zania, right? And it's going to take. And I used to love stories when I was younger about people being put together who you just think would not get along, the jock and the nerd or whatever, and somehow in that story they find a way to work it out together. And so that's part of this story. And both of them return for the second book. Yeah. The first book is mostly them dealing with the hunt for the children. You meet monsters and different things, and of course there's the background thing of the Dark Lord of this world. The Witch Priest is the great entity. The second one, I think what really happens is Benny gets to see the wider world. She sees her first city. She sees her first large kingdom. And she sees all of the problems that the witch priest, who she's trying to get away from, is causing in the world. And so I think what you really see is both the reader and Abeni are introduced just how big this world is and the larger politics that's taking place, that she ends up becoming kind of intimately involved with. They're dragons, and they're based on West African dragons from West African epics. In fact, everybody calls them dragons, but they're like more like giant serpents. Though I reinterpret them like much more like dragons, like we think of dragons in modern fantasy. And that's always the thing you're doing with, by the way. It's like there's traditional fantasy, but all of the folklore that we have, we really reinterpret it to this modern type scheme, right? I mean, as much as Tolkien understood all this stuff about medieval, like Western European fantasy, when he reinterprets it, it's not that, right? It's something completely different by the time he gets his whole hands on it. And I'm doing the similar thing with West African fantasy in this way. And so these dragons, one of them comes from an epic called, for instance, the Epic of Dossi. And so I'm taking these dragons and putting my own spin on them and creating something different. Because I always say, while this world pulls on a lot of West African, Central African, and also African diaspora culture, it's not this world, right? You wouldn't recognize it on a map or anything. It's someplace else completely. It's called for a Benny song. It's called a Benny right now. It's called a Benny and the People Who Could Fly.